everyone. Good evening. How are we all doing? Good. Thumbs up. Fab. Right. Oh, my slides have gone. That's not a good start, is it? Hey, we're back. So, for those who don't know me, my name is Richmond. I'm a developer advocate at Elastic. And before that, I was a front-end developer for just over 10 years. And I've seen some very interesting experiences in my time of how devs, SRE, and support tend to interact. So before I dig into my own stories and how I think tooling such as Playwright and Elastic Synthetics can solve some of the problems that I've seen, I want a quick show of hands. So how many developers do we have in the room? Majority for DevOps, which makes perfect sense. Do I have any support engineers? Hey. Do I have any SRE? Okay. What about product? Any other product people? That's fine. So I mentioned all of these individuals for a reason, because if we unite around a good tool set that we can all use, ultimately we can use the same tool set, not just for testing and validation of features from the user perspective, but also as production monitors. And I'm going to talk about that today. So I'm going to do a quick pop quiz, because whenever I think about this idea of shifting left and right and advantages, I think of the cheat codes I used to use when I was playing games as a kid. And this is one of the most famous cheat codes that I have up in front of me. So up, up, down, down, left, right, B, A, start. I know that it's a bit early for dancing, I know, but there we go. Does anyone know the name of this particular cheat code? It has a very specific name. Sorry? So I have Konami. But I think it goes by a couple of names, doesn't it? Yes. So, yes, you're right. So this actually originally featured in many games by Konami, but I actually know it from Nintendo because I was a bit of a Nintendo geek as a girl. And it was actually created by a guy called Kazuhisa Hashimoto when he was building a game called Gradius in 1985. So you might be wondering, well, we're talking about monitoring and testing today. Why are we talking about cheat codes? What's imperative here is the reason that it was created. It was created because he wanted to get all of the bonuses and advantages at the start, because this predates the save game button, so that he later on could then be able to validate and test the later stages of the levels more easily. And for 10 years, that's what I've been told with regards to shifting left. But as a developer, I personally sometimes find that a little bit scary. It makes this assumption sometimes that we need to know everything. But actually, in my first role, I found out very quickly that wasn't the case. So my first ever developer job, straight out of university, I was not only responsible for development of features, I was also support production management, the lot. As soon as an issue appeared, a user was struggling to submit a particular report to a regulator, I had to be on it. I had to drop whatever I was building and focus on it. But it meant that later, when it was being taken over by a support team, I got a great chance to work with them. And this kind of, for me, instills what DevOps should be. Should be this idea of working together. So we would work together on building out knowledge articles and documentation. I would dive in to help them with issues to help educate the team. And they would also bring back recommendations for making our systems more supportable, more able to be monitored, and all sorts of other enhancements that we as developers wouldn't think of, because we never think of the negative scenario, do we? And I thought that was how all teams worked until I got my first web dev job. And I found out actually that that's not necessarily how it traditionally works. It's actually a bit more of a fractious war. Hopefully people agree. I've heard giggles, so clearly this is the more common experience that people have. So I have had to think about this, and I always struggled to wonder, why does this happen? And I think, honestly, it comes down to three key reasons. So the first of which, we're not great at communicating with each other, and we're not great at empathizing either. So even as the production management and support teams I knew then started to adopt SRE principles, best practices, these things weren't well communicated back to us as developers. It felt like they were chucking things over the fence at us, which is exactly what we'd been doing for years. On their side, they were always thinking, well, all these new features are appearing. I've not got sufficient documentation. I don't know what the architecture is. I don't know what's going on. we're not very great at understanding the other side, sadly. The second reason is prioritization. So quite often when I speak to SREs, one of the largest quibble they have is, well, developers just keep throwing new features over the fence. They never actually take the time to address some of the toil items. And in my experience, that comes down to a lack of common prioritization. Because with the emergence of large-scale agile transformations, what ends up happening normally is we focus too much on that backlog of user features, and we don't have a common prioritization towards toil, towards items that, as we heard from Sven, are really dealing and negating developer joy. And ultimately, we need to try and have a common prioritization because we're really trying to, fulfill the same dream. We're all trying to build useful products for the users that are going to be actually using the applications, ultimately taking out subscriptions and paying our wages. But the final reason is actually down to a distinct tool set. As developers, we're constantly playing with new programming languages, new frameworks, new techniques. On the support of the SRE side, we're always talking about things like tracing and metrics, things like open telemetry, which, did anyone catch Grace and Reese's talk earlier today on it? We've got one. Go back and watch it. It's a very nice introduction. But we need to have a common tool set. We need to know what the other side of the fence is doing. We need to get this to be a more collaborative exercise. And from my experience, one of the biggest issues that I saw was around monitoring and testing, because in my own viewpoint, we were effectively building the same thing twice. Now, hear me out. My last role in banking, we were building end-to-end tests. We were making use of Cypress. There's other alternatives like Playwright. I sadly have some experience with Protractor from my Angular days as well, which thankfully is gone. But it was end-to-end tests that were basically responsible for emulating the user journey, the clicks, and the behaviors they would perform against their application to validate that indeed their actions would prompt the response that we would expect. Synthetic monitoring. We tend to think of this as just simple pings of endpoints running on a schedule, so pinging an HTTP or a TCP endpoint. But actually, I found out later that my colleagues in SRE were in fact using scripts in Selenium hosted within a Pika that you could kind of upload and convert that would therefore allow them to run RFB checks or, case in point, running the same user behavior workflows to validate that the user could perform those actions, and they would run those scripts in a fixed frequency. There was only two differences between these things, aside from the tooling. The first of which is the environment, the fact that we constantly say we can't run the same tooling and for production verification as we can for end-to-end testing, which I'm here to debunk today. And the other thing that was different was the fact that this monitor was having to run on a schedule and had to integrate into their observability tooling. And I say we need to change that. And the way to change that, honestly, is to unite and use a common tool. I know we talk about in the Agile Manifesto that it's individuals and interactions over processes and tools as a key principle. But the tools I'm talking about here are going to help facilitate that interaction and help us work together and also have a common understanding of how the application's intended to work, not just the existing feature set, but the new ones. So if anyone wants to scan the QR code, you'll get access to GitHub repo to go and play afterwards. But the tool set I'm going to walk through today is how you can achieve this using Playwright, an end-to-end testing and automation framework maintained by Microsoft, GitHub Actions, i.e. a CI platform, and Elastic Synthetics for the monitoring thing, which will take those Playwright monitors and suck it into Elastic. So let's talk about how this is going to work. So where do all these pieces fit? Well, you can see here in the grey box, we are going to have our own test project, which maintains these common definitions, these scripts. So we'll have these JavaScript or TypeScript files that are making use of Playwright and Elastic Synthetics. And we'll also have these YAML configs, which are those lightweight monitors. And one of the advantages you have of that is that all of our monitoring is under source control, and it's under our project so that developers and SRE, both sides of the fence, know what's going on with regards to monitoring of the production system. But we're going to use those same monitors as end-to-end tests, run them within our CI or run them locally against a web app that we're just running against localhost or that we spun up locally using Docker or whatever we so choose. It's going to be pushed via API authentication into a testing environment that either is the Elastic managed one or your own private location that you've set up. And then that is going to ping the production web app using those same scripted journeys on a fixed frequency, store the results into Elasticsearch, and then we'll make use of Kibana to see all the nice results, get notified of failures, all those other nice things that we think about with SRE and the idea of eliminating toil. So how do we do it? Well, it's always handy if there's a wizard. So rather than having to go and generate a bunch of files following the documentation, there's a wizard for that. So once you install the Elastic Synthetics npm package, you then can make use of the init wizard. And this will walk you through a simple command line series of steps where you specify where your Elastic cluster is, some default settings like for monitoring how often you want these things to run, and then you end up with something that looks a bit like this. So this is the sample project with all of our monitors, right? So you'll see here I've got configuration file. We will walk through that in a moment. We've got these lightweight pings, which are just YAML, similar to what you might write if you're making use of metric beat. I am not going to go through these today, but if anyone's interested, ask a question, come and find me afterwards, we can walk through it. And then I've also got these sample journey files generated with this example syntax, with everything all set up with Playwright, so I know what's going on. So here's my config. It might look a bit dense. Can everyone see okay? I'm seeing nods. Okay, cool. So one of the things that's nice about this as a test file is that I can change this depending on the environment, which is exactly what we want to do if you think about it. We want to have these same monitors run as end-to-end tests in a pre-production environment and then run as a monitor against our live app in production. So you'll see one of the main parameters in Synthetics config is your URL, which is pointing to my local host. And then if we scooch all the way to the bottom, you'll see that for a production environment, so taking the node environment, which is a parameter into the function, you'll see that I'm able to just pass the production app. So that's my app hosted on Netlify that it's going to be pinged in the case of production. So it's all driven from the node environment variable. I'm able to make use of Playwright options, so any of the configuration from the documentation in Playwright is there. So if you're wanting to do funky things with device emulation, ignoring HTTPS errors, that's where it goes. The default monitor settings, so this would apply to all of the monitors unless you override it specifically in that monitor, but saying how often it's going to run, which Elastic locations it will run, and any private locations that you've set up. And all of this is all generated from the wizard. And then the project settings as well, which is basically where is my Elastic cluster and which Kibana space are my monitors living in. The use of Kibana spaces is quite useful if, for example, you have different SRE teams that might have jurisdiction over different applications. Being able to separate them into their own Kibana spaces, applying appropriate role-based operations on it can mean you can restrict access if that's something you need. And for all the things that are, auto-generated versus stuff I've mucked about with manually, is basically this section at the top and this condition here. Everything else was generated through whatever I passed to the wizard. But this is the main attraction. This is this monitor, this end-to-end test, this dual-purpose thing. It looks like a lot of code, but we're going to walk through it. So what you'll see here is I've got a journey and I've got a step. So is anyone familiar with behavior-driven development, maybe the Gherkin syntax at all? I'm seeing some nods. Cool. So I have a lot of experience from that from my prior role when I was working as a software engineer, and this journey and step kind of reminds me of that a bit. These really are user-focused, and I like the fact that our syntax reflects that, something we don't always see in every single end-to-end test framework that we use. You'll see I can override the monitor schedule if I don't want to use the global options here. But then I've got my before to set things up. You've obviously got before and after, which we're so familiar with unit testing suites, it just makes sense for it to be here. And then in each of my steps, I'm making use of this page object, which is a Playwright page object, which means I can do pretty much anything against it from the Playwright API. So some of the things that you're going to want to do is you want to get elements, which you can do either using the locator, which will take a CSS path. And you'll see we're making use of the await syntax. One of the nice things about Playwright is this idea that it's all very asynchronous driven, unlike some other frameworks I've used before where you have to put timeouts everywhere. Less of an issue here. But I'm able to use other attributes like get data by test ID. So anyone who's written their own intent test before, you might have used the data test ID attribute as a best practice to separate your actual styling CSS from your test access CSS. So definitely recommend still you continue to do that. But we do all those user things like clicks, text entry, anything we want to do. And then we will perform particular assertions. So this example here, I'm checking that I've moved to my order page by getting the URL of the page after the click. And then I'm checking the number of... I am not having a good time today with this, am I? There we go. And then I'm going to be checking for the number of cards I've got. And then I've got this sample of adding things to my cart where I check the text and each item will increment, so it's adding up gradually. Cool. So as I said, I want to run these in two places. So if I'm going to run it and I'm going to do test-driven development, I really want to have a situation where I'm able to run these locally. So you just run it, run test, there you go. I see it's working, I can develop my feature, I can push this monitor along with my changes. It'll go through some form of PR. And then what we'll see is on push, we'll want to do two things. You'll want to on merge, validate that the run is going through as expected. That's the first thing. And then the second thing you're going to want to do is take on pass of those tests, take those monitors and push it so they can then be used against your production deployment. So when you deploy your application, you're going to also want to deploy the monitors too. And this is simulating that. So you'll see I've got my test task here, running against node environment development, because the last thing you want to do is run these tests against production. So make sure you're running against the correct node environment. And then we make use of the synthetics command just to run the test. So this is the other option to do it. Running it out of the journeys folder so that it can actually find them. And then making use of JUnit reporter so that you can then report and publish your own test results. And then the second thing you have is this push command, which is the fun bit. So we're going to push these for production. This push step is actually generated whenever we generate through the wizard. So this will actually push those monitors that have been updated into our Elastic Synthetics cluster, Elastic cluster rather, so that we can use it within Synthetics. And what you'll see is you need to make use of an API key, which you can generate from Synthetics itself. Please use appropriate secret management and hide this key. You don't want anyone pushing any random monitors into your production environment. So just be mindful of that. And obviously the working directory will be against tests, and it's going to be dependent on that test task as well, because you don't want these pushed every single time. You only want it to be pushed when it actually makes sense to. And when that happens, you get these. So this one here is basically our test that we just walked through. So you can see that I've got a duration here of 3 seconds. It's running back and forth inside the background. So this is telling us kind of a trend over time of what the duration is like. Then we can do smart things in here. You can set up what all SREs will be familiar with. So things like anomaly detection, perhaps, to try and figure out if maybe it's starting to degrade, or maybe you've got issues with it kind of not passing a certain number of times and you want to be alerted. So you can make use of alerting capabilities. And then when something does go wrong, you can go in and see what happened. For an individual failure, you'll have screenshots so you can see what happens at every single step. You'll see which error has actually happened. You can see the traces, all the other information. Then just off in the corner, you've got a chart showing duration by step, which is one of the things that I quite like as well, because I always had this experience with end-to-end tests where you'd end up adding in timeouts gradually as your application got bigger. As new changes came in, you would potentially have this situation where the timeouts are getting slightly longer and longer. So being able to see what the duration is over time, is it going up? And then being able to start answering why is an important thing. But even with this, we all know we can't catch everything. Support requests are going to get raised. Users are going to find stuff. That's just how this happens. And we need to be able to react and recreate. And it's a whole lot easier to try and recreate an issue when we have a documented series of steps of what the user did than if we have to just kind of go and figure it out based on minimal information. But we also have a problem where working in multidiscipline teams, perhaps working with support engineers or other individuals, they might not be familiar with Playwright. So we need a way to record these things. So let's have a recorder as well. So you'll see this ticking away in the background. It makes use of Selenium, so it'll launch up the Selenium web browser. It will capture all of the clicks that are being performed against your application within that Selenium web browser. You can test it, run it as many times as you like, and from there, you'll be able to actually see the bare bones of the test. So I'm now expanding it out. We talked about breaking it into these individual steps, following that BDD-like cycle, putting in more meaningful step descriptions so that we know what's going on, perhaps making additions in terms of assertions. So the kind of stuff that you're probably going to want to check is things like visibility of elements. Perhaps you expect things to hide or to show based on particular attributes. Perhaps you want to check things like, is a particular checkbox enabled or disabled? Thinking back to things like form validation, for example. Maybe you want to muck about and change the selectors. Again, I recommend making use of the data test ID one as well. Adding all those assertions as we go, because the important thing here is to show what is expected. If you think about it, adding an assertion to these, even if it's failing, is demonstrating what you expect should be happening. And then we just keep going through. So here, checking the text content to make sure that it has a value of 1. I can then run the test suite finally again to make sure that it's doing everything I want. And then at the end, I export it as code. It can feed back into that cycle again. So this can be used to try and recreate the issue, try and code the fix against, and then ultimately be used as a monitor that pushes all the way back through the cycle again. So we've talked about a lot today. We've talked about the reasons that I've seen culturally, why we tend to still have this issue with the dev and ops sides not playing nice together. And it sounds like that from the giggles in the audience, that might still be a thing. We've talked about as well how using a common tool set to try and facilitate these interactions and working together can be done if you make use of an end-to-end and automation framework within your observability platform. We've talked about an example of that in action, being a tools and action section. So that was using Playwright, Elastic Synthetics, and GitHub Actions. And we've also seen the recorder as well, so that anyone from a non-technical background can join in too, so everyone can ultimately get behind using these monitors as tests. But we've got to think about the cultural impact of this. It is a tool set. But what's important here is that we need to collaborate together. We're all against the same goal. We're all trying to build software that our users use and adore. And the best way to do that is if we have an understanding as developers of SRE best practice and support best practice, and also if that same thing extends on the other side of the fence. So hopefully you take that one message away with you too. So thank you very much, everyone. We have 6 minutes for questions. I'm aware I am getting in the way of DevRocks, but any questions, feel free to ask just now. You can take a scan of the QR code if you haven't already to see the code in action. And if anyone has any other questions or wants to connect, I'm at Carly Richmond on Twitter. And I do have stickers if anyone wants to come and get some too. Thank you very much. Cool. Do I have any questions? I see one down there at the front.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very good. The recorder and the scripts that it generated afterwards, is that Playwright script or is that Elastic Synthetic script?
It's the same script that we walked through, so it's synthetics, but it's Playwright under the covers. So Playwright's an explicit dependency.
Okay.
So all of those interactions that it generates, like the page.locator, is all a Playwright page object that it's using. The thing that's added on the top is that journey and step syntax and the befores and afters.
Perfect.
That stuff is covered under the Elastic Synthetics wrapper, but it just sits on the top.
Okay, cool. Right, thank you.
No worries. Any other questions? Oh, there's another one. I'll let you deal with it. Thank you.
Question about the test data. In our project, in our lower environments, with our end-to-end tests, we would create data, but we wouldn't want to do that in production.
Yes.
Do you have any sort of patterns and tips for how you can sync your monitoring with your end-to-end testing when you don't want to create any production data?
That's a really good question. So I think one of the things to think about is carefully, because you can enable and disable these for particular environments as well. So one thing that you might want to consider is that you have a set of tests or conditional logic that says, you know, in the event I'm running in these environments, I want to pull data from this particular source. So if you're making use of, for example, I know from my Cucumber days, like data table-based formats, that might be something that is worth considering, because obviously you don't want to have leakage. But then also on the other side, if you're running it with even kind of live production data, there might be certain things that you feel you might not be able to recreate. So for example, the cart I was just showing, you might have a situation where the last thing you want to do is try and actually, you know, confirm and pay. In that instance, you might want to think about doing something like, depending on your data provider or your payment provider, they might have test accounts or testing capabilities. So a good example would be Stripe have test cards. So you'd be able to mark those as test cards and run them kind of through. And that would obviously mean that that wouldn't impact and flow down to any other dependent systems, for example. So there's two sides of the coin there. I'd say the best practice I would recommend is have maybe a specific object config that you pull for the non-production environments, and then for production you'd have a different set.
Hi, thank you. It's a question related to the first one. So can Playwright be replaced by any other testing framework?
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, sure. Can the Playwright be replaced by any other testing framework?
Not for the synthetics integration. So what I'd recommend is, depending on the observability or provider you're using, because you'll probably have one already that you're making use of for APM and tracing, they will probably have a synthetic monitoring capability alongside. So I know that's something, obviously we've got it Elastic, but New Relic have it, Apica have their stuff with Zebra Tester, all sorts of different providers do it different ways. So generally the two scripted providers I've seen are Playwright, but also I've seen Selenium used as well. So it's kind of around initiating a conversation to find out what scripted one is being used, because arguably if it's an automation library, it can be used in both places. You can still use Selenium for end-to-end tests. It's, for me, I don't find as elegant as Playwright personally, but certainly that's something that can be done. And even then, I know some other providers, it might be more of a manual step. But obviously one of the advantages of making use of an automation framework under the covers is, rather than having to input the manual steps in, which I've seen with some other observability providers, you can just have the script run in two places, which is the whole advantage here. So I would definitely have a conversation and see which one's supported.
Thank you.
My question about related more for the nature of end-to-end testing, especially, for example, in our case on applications we run there are many third parties that we can integrate, and we calling like Twilio, Fetchfire, and such stuff, and which is the cost per hit.
Yeah.
How we can manage this, including end-to-end testing?
Sorry, can you repeat the challenge? It was breaking up a wee bit.
The challenge is this end-to-end testing journeys, for example, the registration user, including this integration with third parties like receiving SMS or receiving email or such stuff,
Yeah.
which is may including extra cost.
Yeah, so particular actions that you basically won't be able to assert have happened, like sending of an email. Is that what you're meaning?
Not exactly. This end-to-end testing, it will be run on schedule base, right?
Yeah.
So maybe we can run it every 10 minutes or 1 minute or such stuff. So the cost will be high if we can run this every day
Yeah.
or many
Yes.
times. Yes.
Yeah. So with a synthetic monitor, you're right, there is a cost associated with it because you're running it on a fixed term frequency. That's where, I guess, from an SRE point of view, there's always a trade-off and a balance. I mean, obviously, the schedule is running for the running against production. If you're wanting to put a schedule against your CI, for example, to run the same thing, the same monitors, perhaps as a nightly, then you would do that within your CI itself. And obviously for local development, you wouldn't have a schedule. So it would only really ideally be against production. But even in that regard, you need to be cautious because there's a toll and associated with that as well, right? If you think about it, it's adding an element of load because it is running through particular stages in your application. So that's where you need to find the balance of monitoring, of running it on a frequency that's regular enough where you actually have, useful insights coming in that it can alert you of potential degradation and issues that need to be hopped on and dealt with, but also is not going to kind of cause major issues. So you might need to think about that frequency. You might also think about times when you might need to increase it or decrease it or even pause it altogether. Think of Black Friday for an e-commerce platform as a really good example. It might be useful to be pinging that more regularly, but at the same time, if your application's under high load, you're added further load into it. So maybe you'll have to assess which of those options is really right for you. But that's the nature of synthetic monitoring. It's the same thing with a basic HTTP ping. Everything really is a trade-off. I hope that answers your question.
Yep. Thank you.
Nodding. Cool. Thank you. Cool. Right, I think time is up. So thank you very much, everyone. And if anyone has any other questions or would like some stickers, just come over and say hi. Thank you.